I'm Claire, 32 years old, and I still remember the exact moment my own sister stood up in the middle of my engagement dinner and told everyone she and my fiancé had been together for 6 months. My mother didn't gasp. She smiled, reached across the table, and squeezed my sister's hand like she was congratulating her on a promotion. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to be your family. Hit that like button and subscribe. This story is for you. My fiancé, Daniel, didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He sat there with his hand already resting on my sister's chair, as if the ring on my finger had simply become an inconvenient prop he was waiting for someone else to remove. My sister, Ashley, 28 years old and golden in every way our mother had always preferred, dabbed at a single perfect tear and said, "I didn't want it to happen this way, Claire, but I love him." I sat frozen at the head of the table I had spent 3 months planning, surrounded by 20 relatives who had all apparently known before I did. My mother's voice cut through the silence next, not with comfort, but with something far colder. "Maybe it's for the best," she said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Ashley's always been better at knowing what she wants. You've always been the one who works too hard and notices too little." I looked around that table at every familiar face refusing to meet my eyes, and I understood, with a kind of clarity that felt almost physical, that this had not happened in a single evening. This had been built for weeks, maybe months, by people who had simply been waiting for the right moment to hand me the bill. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my dress, and did not cry. I did not scream. I looked at Daniel, then at Ashley, then finally at my mother, and I said only one sentence before I walked out of that restaurant alone. "You have no idea what you just did." None of them understood what those words actually meant. They thought I was simply another humiliated woman walking out with nothing but a broken engagement and a bruised ego. What none of them knew, not my sister, not my mother, not the man who had just discarded me in front of our entire family, was that Daniel's growing tech startup, the one he had built his entire new identity around, was standing on a foundation that legally belonged to me. And in exactly 11 days, that foundation was about to be pulled out from under all 3 of them at once. Daniel and I met 4 years ago in a graduate engineering lab at MIT, back when he was still an ambitious but perpetually broke PhD candidate, and I was finishing my own doctorate in materials science, quietly building something in the back corner of a shared lab that nobody else seemed to think was worth their time. He used to bring me coffee at midnight when I was running failed experiment after failed experiment, telling me I'd figure it out eventually. For a long time, I believed that kind of patience meant something real. My mother never approved of him at first, not because he was ambitious, but because he was, in her words, a nobody with nothing behind him. She had a very particular way of measuring people, one she had applied to me my entire childhood. Ashley was the daughter who charmed every relative at Thanksgiving, who never had to try particularly hard at anything because things simply arranged themselves conveniently around her. I was the daughter who stayed in the lab until 2 in the morning, who won awards nobody in my family ever attended, who was, according to my mother, impressive on paper, but a little exhausting in person. I spent 6 years developing a proprietary polymer compound capable of dramatically extending battery life in small electronic devices, the kind of breakthrough that sounds abstract until you understand what it could mean for an entire industry desperate for exactly that solution. I filed the patent under my own name the year before Daniel, and I got engaged quietly, without any announcement, because that was simply how I operated. I didn't need applause. I needed the work to be right. When Daniel decided to leave his research position and start his own hardware startup 2 years ago, he came to me one night, nervous in a way I'd rarely seen him, and asked if he could license my compound to build his first product line. I said yes without hesitation. I trusted him completely. I even helped him draft parts of the technical documentation myself, staying up late beside him just like we used to in that lab, believing we were building something together. What I didn't fully understand until much later was how carefully Daniel had begun rewriting that story in every investor meeting he attended. In pitch decks, in press interviews, and casual conversations with people who mattered, the breakthrough compound stopped being something he had licensed from me and slowly became something he described as our joint research, then eventually, in later versions of his pitch, simply his innovation. I never corrected him publicly, mostly because I was busy with my own postdoctoral research and partly because I still believed, foolishly, that whatever credit got blurred between us didn't matter, since we were about to become husband and wife anyway. Ashley, meanwhile, had been working as a marketing consultant for exactly the kind of startups Daniel was trying to court, moving through venture capital circles with the same effortless charm she'd always used on relatives at family dinners. I never once suspected that the increasing number of networking dinners Daniel mentioned attending with her, always described as purely professional, were slowly becoming something else entirely. I had no idea, sitting across from my own engagement dinner 3 weeks later, smiling for photographs while my sister quietly built a relationship with the man I loved, that the very patent I had trusted Daniel to build his company around, the one thing he had never bothered to formally license through a proper legal agreement, because he assumed our marriage would make the paperwork unnecessary, was about to become the exact thing that ended his entire company. 2 weeks before the engagement dinner, Daniel asked me to sign a document he described as just a standard update to the licensing paperwork, purely a formality before the next funding round. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, half distracted by wedding seating charts, barely skimming the pages before he slid them across to me with a pen already uncapped. I trusted him. I always had. I signed where he pointed, without reading the fine print buried on page 11, a clause quietly transferring exclusive commercial rights to the compound from my name into the name of his company. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told myself it was simply part of merging our lives together, the same way we were merging bank accounts and future last names. It never once crossed my mind that a man I had shared a lab bench with for 4 years was quietly restructuring our entire professional relationship days before he planned to replace me in every other way as well. What I didn't know, what I would only learn 11 days later, sitting in my cousin's cramped apartment reading legal documents that made my stomach turn, was that Daniel had scheduled a major funding meeting with a venture capital firm for the following week. A meeting where he intended to present the compound tent as fully and exclusively owned by his company, no licensing complications, no co-inventor credit, nothing that might raise questions during due diligence. The engagement dinner scandal, the public humiliation, the abrupt announcement about Ashley, none of it was really about love. It was about clearing an obstacle before a $10 million series a round closed. Ashley had been more involved than I ever imagined. I learned later that she had spent the better part of 2 months quietly coaching Daniel through how to present their relationship to investors as evidence of founder stability, positioning herself as his forthcoming co-founder in marketing and communications, someone the venture firm's due diligence team would inevitably interview. She needed me gone, cleanly and publicly, before that interview happened, because any lingering connection to me as the actual inventor threatened to complicate the story they were selling. My mother, it turned out, had known about the affair for nearly a month before the dinner. She had encouraged Ashley, reassuring her that a bit of temporary family awkwardness was a small price to pay for what she called finally landing someone worth landing. I found out through my aunt 3 days after the dinner that my mother had specifically chosen the restaurant, the seating arrangement, the timing of Ashley's announcement, treating the entire humiliation like a carefully staged product launch rather than the destruction of her own daughter's engagement. Standing outside that restaurant after walking out, I didn't yet understand the full scale of what had been built against me. All I knew was that my fiancé had replaced me with my sister in front of our entire family, and that somewhere in a filing cabinet in Daniel's office was a signature of mine on a document I had never properly read. My cousin Priya answered her phone before the first ring finished. She had spent the last 3 years working as an intellectual property attorney at a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of person who read licensing agreements the way other people read grocery lists. "Don't sign anything else. Don't talk to him. Bring me every document you have," she told me, already pulling her coat on before I'd finished explaining what happened. "Claire, if what you're describing is true, we need to see exactly what that document on page 11 actually says, before Daniel walks into that funding meeting believing he owns something that legally might still belong entirely to you." I didn't know yet how right she would turn out to be. Priya spread the licensing document across her kitchen table at midnight, a highlighter in one hand and a cold cup of tea forgotten beside her laptop. I sat across from her, still wearing the dress I'd put on for what was supposed to be the happiest night of my engagement, watching her read the same 11 pages over and over, her expression darkening with each pass. "This is deliberately confusing," she said finally, tapping the clause on page 11. "It's written to look like a routine amendment, but what it actually does is transfer exclusive commercial rights of the patent from you personally into Halcyon Technologies." She looked up at me. "That's Daniel's company, correct?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "There's a problem for him, though," Priya continued, flipping to the signature page. "This document requires 2 signatures to be legally binding, yours and a witnessed countersignature from Daniel as an authorized company officer, notarized within 30 days. He never had it notarized. He never even signed his own copy." She sat back, a slow, careful smile crossing her face for the first time that night. "Which means, legally, this transfer never actually completed. As far as the United States Patent and Trademark Office is concerned, you are still the sole registered inventor and rights holder of that compound." I stared at her, not fully able to process what she was telling me. "So the company doesn't own it?" "The company has been operating under the assumption that it does," Priya said, "but assumption isn't ownership. If Daniel walks into that investor meeting claiming exclusive rights to a patent that legally still belongs to you, that's not just an oversight. Depending on what he tells them, that could be securities fraud." I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at Priya's kitchen table long after she finally dozed off on the couch, staring at a printed copy of my own patent filing, the one I had submitted quietly 2 years earlier, without telling anyone outside the university, the one Daniel had spent the last several months slowly rewriting into his own origin story. Over the following days, Priya helped me understand exactly how deep the deception ran. She discovered that Halcyon Technologies' pitch deck, the one currently being circulated to venture capital firms across Boston, described the compound as developed internally by our founding team, with no mention of my name, my university affiliation, or the original patent filing at all. Daniel had built an entire narrative of his own genius on top of 6 years of my research, and he was 3 days away from selling that narrative to investors for $10 million. Ashley, meanwhile, appeared to be moving forward exactly as planned. A cousin who still followed her online sent me a screenshot of a professional headshot Ashley had recently posted, captioned "Thrilled to step into a new role at Halcyon Technologies as head of communications." The photo had been taken, based on the metadata Priya pulled up out of habit, the same week as our engagement dinner. She hadn't been improvising a sudden romance. She had already accepted a job title before she ever stood up at that table. My mother called twice during those first few days, her voice carrying the same brisk, faintly irritated tone she used whenever she thought I was being unreasonably dramatic about something. "You'll get over it, Claire," she said during the second call, before I hung up without responding. "You always land on your feet. You're the practical one." She had no idea how literally true that was about to become. Priya called me into her office 4 days later, her voice carrying a controlled urgency I hadn't heard from her since law school finals. When I arrived, she had a second document spread across her desk beside the original licensing agreement, this one printed from Halcyon Technologies' publicly filed pitch materials obtained through a contact she had at the venture capital firm handling the funding round. "I need you to look at this slide," she said, sliding the printout toward me. It was a technical overview page, listing the compound's chemical properties in exact detail. Figures I recognized instantly, because I had generated them myself, in my own handwriting, in a lab notebook still sitting on a shelf in my old university office. "He copied my research notes directly into the pitch deck," I said quietly. "Not just copied," Priya said. "He submitted this exact data as supporting evidence in a provisional patent application filed under Halcyon Technologies' name 3 weeks ago. An application built entirely on research generated under your original, still active patent." She let that settle for a moment before continuing. "Claire, this isn't just a licensing dispute anymore. This is patent fraud. He's attempting to register intellectual property he does not legally own, using data lifted directly from your existing filing." I felt something shift inside me, the same cold clarity I remembered from countless nights in the lab when an experiment finally clicked into place after months of failure. What happens if he presents this deck to investors before the fraudulent application is discovered? If the funding round closes based on false representation of ownership, Priya said, the investors could later sue Halcyon Technologies for material misrepresentation. Daniel could face significant personal liability, on top of the underlying patent issue. But right now, none of them know what we know, which means we control exactly when they find out. Over the next several days, Priya worked quietly behind the scenes, filing formal notice with the Patent Office to flag the fraudulent provisional application, while carefully avoiding anything that might alert Daniel that we were building a case. I continued attending my postdoctoral research meetings as though nothing had happened, saying nothing to colleagues who had heard rumors about the broken engagement, letting everyone believe I was simply a heartbroken woman quietly nursing a wound. Meanwhile, Ashley began appearing more publicly at Halcyon Technologies events, giving brief interviews to local business publications joining a company built on genuine innovation. My mother forwarded me one such article without comment, though I suspected, even then, some part of her enjoyed watching me see it. The investor meeting Daniel had scheduled was pushed back once, then confirmed for the following Thursday, an all-hands pitch presentation to Ridgeline Capital, one of the most prominent venture firms in the city, with a room full of partners expected to attend, along with several smaller angel investors who had already expressed informal interest in joining the round. Priya reached out to a contact inside Ridgeline's due diligence team, a former law school classmate who owed her a favor, and quietly confirmed the exact date, time, and location of the pitch. She didn't explain why she needed it. She simply asked, and her classmate simply told her. "They are presenting Thursday at 10 in the morning," Priya told me, closing her laptop with a decisive click. "Full partner meeting at their office downtown. Claire, I think it's time we RSVP'd." I looked at her for a long moment, feeling the last of my hesitation finally settle into something steadier. "Let's make sure we're not late." Priya insisted we handle the next step exactly the way she would handle any high-stakes litigation strategy, methodically, and without a single unnecessary risk. "We don't confront him before Thursday," she told me over coffee 2 days before the pitch meeting. "If he senses anything is wrong, he'll postpone, restructure the deck, maybe even quietly settle the ownership question before Ridgeline ever sees it. Right now, He thinks he's already won. That's the only advantage we have left. It took everything in me not to march straight to Halcyon Technologies' office and demand answers the moment Priya confirmed the fraudulent patent filing. Every instinct told me to stop this immediately, to protect 6 years of my own research before it could be stolen out from under me in a boardroom full of strangers. But the same quiet discipline that had carried me through years of failed lab experiments told me Priya was right. Rushing now would only give Daniel room to maneuver. "What do you need me to do?" I asked her. "Keep behaving exactly as you have been," Priya said. "Say nothing to Daniel, nothing to Ashley, nothing to your mother. Let them believe you're exactly as devastated and passive as they assume you are." She slid a folder across the table toward me, containing formal notarized documentation, confirming my unaltered legal ownership of the original patent, along with the flagged fraudulent application Priya had already filed notice against with the patent office. "We're not walking into Ridgeline's office to argue. We're walking in to present facts no one in that room will be able to dispute." That same week, I received an unexpected phone call from a name I hadn't heard in over a year, Dr. Mara Chen, my former doctoral advisor, now serving as a technical consultant for several venture capital firms evaluating hardware startups, including, as it happened, Ridgeline Capital. She had heard through mutual academic contacts about a promising battery compound startup pitching investors, and had recognized the underlying chemistry from my own dissertation the moment she reviewed the technical specifications circulating among Ridgeline's partners. "Claire, is this your compound?" she asked, her voice sharp with the same directness I remembered from years of brutal thesis defenses. "Because the pitch materials I was sent don't mention your name anywhere," and I told her everything, carefully, factually, the way she had trained me to present any finding during my years in her lab. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her response was immediate and unequivocal. "I'm scheduled to sit in on that Thursday presentation as a technical advisor to the partners," she said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, I have both a professional and an ethical obligation to raise questions during that meeting, regardless of what happens afterward." Priya, when I told her, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. "That's better than anything we could have engineered ourselves," she said. An independent technical expert, already inside the room with no connection to either of us, raising the exact right question at the exact right moment. "Claire, we're not just walking into that meeting with paperwork anymore. We're walking in with a witness the investors will already trust." Thursday morning arrived with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in weeks. I stood in front of my closet for a long time before choosing a plain charcoal blazer, nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself. Priya had been very clear about that too. "We are not there to make a scene," she reminded me as we walked toward her car. "We're there to make sure the truth is simply impossible to ignore." Ridgeline Capital's office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the Charles River, the kind of space designed specifically to make founders feel both welcomed and quietly evaluated the moment they stepped off the elevator. Priya and I arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled pitch, checking in at reception under her firm's name, listed as observers attending on behalf of a separate intellectual property matter, a technicality Priya had arranged through her contact days earlier. We were shown into a small side conference room adjacent to the main presentation space, separated by a glass wall that let us see clearly into the room where Daniel would soon be pitching. Through the glass, I watched him arrive, confident and polished in a fitted navy suit, carrying himself with the same easy charm he'd once used to convince a room full of PhD students that his research proposal deserved more lab funding than anyone else's. Ashley walked in beside him a few minutes later, dressed sharply, clutching a tablet, already rehearsing what looked like her portion of the communications pitch under her breath. Neither of them noticed us through the glass. Why would they? As far as either of them knew, I was still sitting somewhere at home, quietly grieving a broken engagement, exactly as planned. At exactly 10 o'clock, the partners filed into the main room, along with Dr. Chen, who took a seat near the back corner with a legal pad and an expression of polite, professional neutrality that gave nothing away. Daniel began his presentation smoothly, walking the partners through Halcyon Technologies' growth trajectory, market opportunity, and technical roadmap, eventually arriving at the slide Priya and I had been waiting for, the compound's chemical properties, listed in exact detail, credited entirely to our internal research and development team. Dr. Chen's hand rose almost immediately. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice calm but precise, cutting cleanly through Daniel's rehearsed rhythm, "but I recognize this exact compound structure from a doctoral dissertation I supervised at MIT. Could you clarify who specifically on your internal team developed this formulation, and when?" I watched through the glass as Daniel's confident expression flickered, just slightly, before he recovered with a practiced smile. "Our founding technical team has been developing this compound for the past 2 years," he said. "It represents years of internal research." "That's interesting," Dr. Chen replied, flipping open a folder of her own. "Because the specific formulation ratios on this slide are identical, down to the decimal point, to research published under a provisional patent filed nearly 3 years ago by a researcher named Claire Bennett." Ripple of quiet movement passed through the partners seated around the table. I happened to know Dr. Bennett's work quite well. I was her doctoral advisor. Daniel's composure cracked visibly now, his eyes darting toward the glass wall separating the 2 rooms, though he still hadn't seen us sitting there. "There may be some overlap in the underlying chemistry," he said, his voice tightening, "but the commercial application and formulation process were developed entirely by—" Mr. Whitmore, one of the senior partners, interrupted, his tone shifting from polite interest to something considerably sharper. "Are you telling this room that Halcyon Technologies holds full, exclusive, undisputed rights to this compound?" Daniel hesitated for exactly 1 second too long. That hesitation was all Priya needed. She rose from her seat beside me, straightened her blazer, and walked calmly toward the door separating the 2 conference rooms. "Actually," she said, opening the door and stepping into the main room with a folder already open in her hands, "I think it's time this room heard from the compound's actual, legally registered inventor." Every head in the room turned as I stepped through the doorway behind Priya, and I watched the exact moment recognition crossed Daniel's face. Not confusion, but a raw, unguarded panic that stripped away every ounce of the polished confidence he'd walked in with. Ashley froze mid-motion, her tablet still raised as if she intended to continue her portion of the pitch, her mouth slightly open with nothing coming out. "Claire," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly on my name, "what are you doing here?" "I was invited," I said calmly, taking the seat Priya gestured toward at the edge of the table, directly across from the senior partners. Or more accurately, my attorney was invited to observe a matter relevant to a patent currently under formal dispute with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The room's energy shifted instantly, every partner's attention sharpening at the words "formal dispute." The senior partner who had questioned Daniel moments earlier, a silver-haired man named Gordon Ellis, leaned forward with his hands folded on the table. "Ms. Bennett, I'd like to understand exactly what we're looking at here." Priya opened her folder and began laying documents across the table with the same unhurried precision she'd used at her own kitchen table weeks earlier. "This is the original patent filing for the compound your firm is currently being pitched, registered under Claire Bennett's name 2 years ago, well before Halcyon Technologies existed as a company," she said. This is a licensing agreement between Ms. Bennett and Halcyon Technologies, which, upon legal review, was never properly executed. It requires a notarized countersignature that Mr. Whitmore never obtained. Which means, as of this morning, Ms. Bennett remains the sole legal rights holder of this compound. Gordon Ellis picked up the licensing document, scanning it with the focused intensity of a man who had clearly reviewed 1,000 contracts exactly like it. Beside him, a younger partner pulled up something on her laptop, cross-referencing the patent number Priya had provided against a public database, her expression darkening as the results loaded. "There's more," Priya continued, sliding a second set of documents forward. 3 weeks ago, Halcyon Technologies filed a provisional patent application containing chemical data taken directly from Ms. Bennett's original research notes, without her knowledge or consent. We've already filed formal notice with the Patent Office flagging this application as fraudulent. Daniel's face had gone completely pale now, his hands gripping the edge of the presentation podium as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice rising slightly, the confident pitch deck cadence completely abandoned. "Claire and I were engaged. We built this together. She helped me with the documentation herself. Helping you draft technical language for a licensing agreement," Priya said evenly, "is not the same as transferring legal ownership, Mr. Whitmore, especially when that transfer was never properly finalized." Dr. Chen, still seated near the back of the room, spoke up again, her tone measured but unmistakably pointed. "I'd also like to note, for the record, that I've personally reviewed Ms. Bennett's doctoral research over several years. The formulation presented today is unmistakably her work. I would strongly encourage this firm to pause any further consideration of this investment until ownership is fully resolved." Gordon Ellis set down the licensing agreement and looked directly at Daniel, his expression no longer curious, but coldly evaluating. "Mr. Whitmore, you presented this company's core technology to my partners as fully owned, unencumbered intellectual property. Based on what I'm seeing in front of me, that representation appears, at minimum, seriously misleading." Ashley finally found her voice, though it came out thinner and less certain than the polished tone she'd rehearsed earlier. "I didn't know any of this," she said quickly, looking between her partners and Daniel. "I only handle communications. I wasn't involved in the patent filings." I looked at my sister for a long moment, feeling something settle into place that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. "You knew enough to accept a job title the same week you stood up at my engagement dinner," I said quietly. "I think this room can decide for themselves how much you actually didn't know." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence after that, broken only by the quiet clicking of the younger partner's keyboard as she continued cross-referencing the patent filings on her screen. Gordon Ellis leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with the same cold precision he might apply to a balance sheet that no longer added up. "Mr. Whitmore," he said finally, "I've sat through a great many pitch meetings in my career. I have never once had a company's actual, legally documented inventor walk through that door mid-presentation to inform me the core technology isn't owned by the founder pitching it." He turned to the younger partner beside him. "Sarah, what does the patent database show?" "Confirmed," she said, turning her laptop slightly so Gordon could see the screen himself. "Original filing under Claire Bennett, university affiliated at time of submission, still active and in good standing. There's also a flag here, filed this morning, noting a fraudulent provisional application connected to the same compound, submitted under Halcyon Technologies." Gordon closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose in the particular way of a man calculating exactly how much time and money his firm had nearly wasted. When he opened them again, his gaze settled on Daniel with unmistakable finality. "This meeting is over." Ridgeline Capital will not be moving forward with this investment, and given what's been presented today, I intend to notify the other firms in our syndicate network before this deck reaches anyone else's desk. Daniel's carefully constructed composure finally shattered completely. Gordon, please. We can resolve the ownership issue quickly. This doesn't have to affect the round. You misrepresented ownership of your core intellectual property to secure a $10 million investment, Gordon said, cutting him off without raising his voice, which somehow made the words land harder than if he'd shouted them. Depending on what the SEC determines about intent, that's not a delay, Mr. Whitmore. That's potentially fraud. I watched Daniel's eyes dart toward me one last time, searching for something. An apology, a negotiation, some flicker of the trust we'd once shared across a lab bench 4 years earlier. I gave him nothing. I simply sat there, calm and steady, exactly the way Priya had coached me to remain, letting the weight of the truth do the work I no longer needed to do myself. Ashley gathered her tablet with shaking hands, refusing to look at anyone as she moved toward the door. "This is insane," she muttered, more to herself than to the room. "I actually believed we were building something real." "You believed exactly what was convenient for you to believe," I said quietly, not unkindly, simply honestly. "The same way you believed it was fine to stand up at my engagement dinner because Mom told you it was." She didn't respond. She simply walked out, and Daniel followed a few seconds later, his earlier confidence replaced by the stiff, hollow posture of a man who had just watched every version of his future dissolve in front of a room full of strangers. Priya began gathering the documents from the table, her expression calm but unmistakably satisfied. Gordon Ellis extended his hand toward me before we left, an unusual gesture given the circumstances. "Dr. Bennett," he said, the first time anyone in that room had used my proper title all morning, "if you ever decide to pursue commercializing this compound independently, I'd welcome the opportunity to have that conversation properly, on its own merits." I shook his hand, feeling something shift inside me that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally being seen for exactly what I had built, without anyone else's name attached to it. "I think," I said, "that conversation might happen sooner than you expect." Chapter 5, Part 1, Epilogue. News of Halcyon Technologies' collapsed funding round spread through Boston's venture capital circles faster than I expected. Gordon Ellis followed through on his word, quietly informing the other firms in his syndicate network about the ownership dispute, before the pitch deck could reach a single other investor's desk. Within 2 weeks, every remaining conversation Daniel had been counting on simply stopped returning his calls. The Patent Office formally rejected Halcyon Technologies' fraudulent provisional application within the month, citing clear evidence of prior existing ownership under my original filing. Priya, working alongside the university's legal counsel, helped me finalize a proper, fully executed licensing structure of my own design, one that made absolutely certain no future partner could ever quietly rewrite the story of who had actually built what. Daniel resigned as CEO of Halcyon Technologies before the remaining board members could formally push him out, though by then, there was very little company left to be CEO of. Without the compound, without the funding round, and without any other viable technology in development, Halcyon quietly dissolved within 4 months. I heard, through a former lab colleague who still followed him professionally, that Daniel eventually took a mid-level engineering role at a much smaller firm, the kind of position he once would have considered far beneath the future he'd imagined for himself. Ashley's career took a similarly steep turn. The marketing consultancy she had built her reputation through quietly stopped renewing her contracts once word of the fraudulent pitch meeting circulated among the same small, tightly connected group of startup founders and investors she had spent years cultivating relationships with. Reputation, I learned, moves through those circles just as quickly as capital does. My mother called exactly once after everything became public, her voice noticeably smaller than I remembered it. "I didn't know it would go this far, Claire," she said, as though the scale of the fallout was somehow the only part she regretted, rather than the betrayal itself. I listened politely, said very little, and did not offer her the reassurance she seemed to be hoping for. I moved out of the apartment Daniel and I had shared 2 weeks after the Ridgeline meeting into a small place near the university, close enough to my old lab that I could walk there on mornings when I needed to think. Priya helped me draft a formal statement clarifying my role in the compound's development, which several academic and industry publications picked up within days, finally attaching my name publicly to 6 years of work that had briefly, painfully, almost belonged to someone else's story. Dr. Chen reached out again a few weeks later, this time with a different kind of proposal entirely, an introduction to a small group of independent investors interested in funding the compound's commercialization directly through me, without any of the complications that had unraveled Halcyon Technologies from the inside. I sat with that offer for a long time before responding, thinking about every late night in that graduate lab, every quiet hour spent building something nobody else believed was worth their attention, and every family dinner where being the practical one had somehow always meant being the one nobody thought to protect. I said yes. 18 months have passed since I walked out of that engagement dinner with nothing but a torn napkin still clutched in one hand, and the quiet certainty that something inside me had permanently changed. The company I built with Dr. Chen's introduction, Meridian Materials, now holds 3 additional patents beyond the original compound, employs 22 engineers across a small research facility outside Cambridge, and recently closed its own funding round, one where every slide credited exactly the people who had actually done the work. Daniel still works that mid-level engineering role at the smaller firm, according to the last update I heard secondhand. I don't think about him often anymore, though occasionally, when I walk past the building where Halcyon Technologies used to occupy an entire floor, now leased out to 3 unrelated small businesses, I feel something closer to quiet closure than lingering anger. Ashley moved to a different city entirely about a year ago, starting over in a market where her name hadn't yet become synonymous with the collapsed pitch meeting that industry insiders still occasionally reference as a cautionary tale. We haven't spoken since the day she walked out of Ridgeline's conference room. I don't imagine we will anytime soon, and for the first time in my life, I've stopped feeling guilty about that particular silence. My mother sends the occasional message around holidays, careful and non-committal, the kind of messages that ask nothing and offer nothing, being beyond a polite acknowledgement that I still exist. I respond when I feel like it, and I don't when I don't. It took me most of my adult life to understand that I was allowed to make that choice freely, without needing anyone's permission to protect my own peace. Priya became not just my attorney but one of my closest friends, someone who still occasionally reminds me, half joking, that she's available for round 2 if anyone ever underestimates me again. Dr. Chen sits on Meridian's advisory board now, still asking the same sharp, precise questions she once used to challenge my dissertation defense, questions that continue to make the company better every single quarter. I think about that dinner sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude I never expected to feel. My family spent years teaching me, without ever saying it directly, that being quietly competent meant being quietly overlooked. What they never understood is that the very qualities they dismissed as unremarkable, patience, precision, the willingness to build something real without needing applause for it, were exactly the qualities that eventually protected everything that actually mattered. I am not the sister who works too hard and notices too little. I never was. I was simply the one who was paying attention the entire time, quietly building the one thing no one could take from me without my knowledge. If you've ever had your work, your worth, or your voice quietly taken by someone who claimed it as their own, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this journey meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories like